In this video, I'm going to give you some strategies and tips for when you are facilitating the summary conversation for Unit 7, Day 31, Lesson 16a, the quadratic formula. The focus question of this lesson is, why do we need the quadratic formula to help us solve some quadratic equations? Our goal of this lesson is to present students with quadratic equations that are really challenging to solve using either computing the square or factoring. And as a result of this, they are starting to think about, well, is there another strategy I can use? And then they will be introduced to the quadratic formula in the next lesson. So the explore portion of this lesson presents students with a few different equations, and they're asked to solve the equation by either rewriting it in factored form or completing the square. And so I created this lesson on Desmos, and on slide 8, you see slide 7 is where this explore starts. So I chose to use the second equation as the one that we will have our summary conversation around, but you can choose whatever one makes sense and fits for you. And so for this one, I have a prompt here on slide 9 that asks students to show how they solve the problem. And so I took a picture of this student work, and I put it under the snapshot section of this lesson. And so to facilitate the conversation, while students are working, you might allow them to work in pairs. You might assign some students to use completing the square and some students to use factoring for certain questions. Some questions are going to be a little bit easier to use one or the other strategy. And then the last question, you cannot factor it to get rational coefficients. So that one, completing the square, is the only option. So I would present this to the students, and I'll leave some space for us to have a conversation around this. What are some benefits and drawbacks of solving by factoring for this equation? What are some benefits and drawbacks of solving by completing the square? And you can give students some time to really think about this and talk about it. They might type into the chat, or you might actually, depending on your class, students might be willing to share out verbally. So in this one specifically, factoring is going to be a lot simpler. It takes less steps. There aren't as many decimals or fractions involved. You only get a decimal at the end. But a drawback by solving by factoring is you are going to have to do a lot of guess and checking to determine what the two factors are. Completing the square, especially for this one, there are a lot of steps. There are a lot of spaces to make mistakes. You're working with fractions and decimals. It's a very tedious process. And you might not even have students that are going to be able to get to this point. So you might even feature work where someone started completing the square and then kind of just crossed it out and didn't use that as a strategy, because it is such a tedious and challenging way to solve this question. Somebody might say they prefer completing this square because they don't have to use guess and check. They can immediately just know what the next part of the constant would. They can just use their own strategies to solve it without having to use guess and check. Both of these students can check their work by substituting back in, but they're both very tedious, difficult processes to use. So we want students to come away thinking that, what is the next thing we can do? Is there another strategy? Because these strategies are not strategies that make sense or work for me. And like I said, some students may not be able to figure out how to factor this either, and that's okay. Within this conversation, you can also prompt students, what method did you choose to solve this question? You might go back and show another one and ask, well, what did you use to solve this one? Why? Did you ever find yourself choosing one method and then switching to another? Does anybody start completing the square here and then be like, nope, I'm going to factor here? Why did you do that? And then, did you run into any challenges when rewriting the equation for completing the square? What challenges did you run into? For this one, right, it's like factoring out that 5 first is going to be really tricky, and just knowing how to complete the square when you have a leading coefficient greater than 1. And then after students complete this, you can give them some time to then just answer this question on their own. What are some benefits and drawbacks of completing the square? What are some benefits and drawbacks of factoring, to synthesize that conversation? And then introducing students to the fact that there is another way to solve these equations. It is going to be the quadratic formula. You are going to learn the quadratic formula in a future lesson, and it's going to help you when you are presented with these really challenging equations that are very difficult to factor or use completing the square. And so once you present them with it, then and letting them know that, they can answer this last question: why do we need it? Why is the quadratic formula important? And it's because completing the square or factoring aren't always going to be the most efficient ways to solve a quadratic equation. They might not always even work for certain situations. Okay? And then you will move on to the next lesson on the quadratic formula. So in summary, we want students to really struggle with and think deeply about these two strategies and start to really crave another strategy which they will be introduced to, building curiosity, building interest in using the quadratic formula, and also starting to think about what types of equations will I use the quadratic formula, because it's not going to always be the best strategy, and that's what we'll continue to talk about in the next couple lessons.